we have to look at that and say, no, no freaking kidding, this happened. How can you be surprised that people are rioting and protesting and getting violent in a system that has treated them with suspicion, with violence, with anger, and with abuse? How can you sit here and expect people to just sit idly by their entire lives? Granted, most people who are against protesting and rioting haven't been involved in any type of police crime. Most of them are in the middle class and are generally, for the most part, protected from police violence because they don't interact with it on a daily basis. But these are also the people that need to understand that not everyone has lived the same life as you. Not everyone has been protected in the way you have been, or ignored at least by the police. So you do kind of have to take into consideration that rioting, though it is dangerous and though it kills people and though it destroys property and it's ruined lots of small businesses in a way that they can't recover, it has been in the service of creating change that has, as far as we can see, been an effective route for the people to take. These protests have created change. So one could say those sacrifices are absolutely necessary. Me personally, I wish that certain properties were targeted. I wish that the wealthy class and their businesses were targeted while small businesses were not. I wish that nobody was killed during these riots. And in a perfect world, maybe that would be the case. But unfortunately, in this world, we have to take the good with the bad. We have to accept that a lot of people lost their lives and a lot of people lost their financial stability because of these protests. And during a pandemic, it's doubly a terrible time and place for that to happen. But I can't bring myself to say that it wasn't necessary. It was absolutely necessary. Anytime that people feel like their rights are not respected, especially in a capitalist Republican society, that is absolutely a time when people need to stand up for themselves. Protesting for me is at least something that is a respectable form of, civil disobedience, right? It is a form of drawing attention to a problem. Rioting, I'm more on the fence about, but I can't say that it hasn't had a positive effect for the people of this country. But then the third party steps in, and the third party is where things get a little complicated. Because at least in the links below, as you can check out, there have been situations where organized crime has used the riots and protests as coverage so they can conduct looting and stealing and abducting people and committing rape and breaking into people's houses and all these different things. And we kind of have to look at it from the perspective of, should that be allowed to happen? Should we be allowing riots and protests to function as cover for these organized groups? You can also see in the case of just standard protests where the KKK, and again linked below, have shown up to these protests and conducted violence and conducted this confrontational behavior, and even situations where the Ku Klux Klan have threatened to come to cities like Birmingham and threaten violence even though none has happened. But people hearing at least things along the lines within social media of, we're coming to kill every single person we find out in the streets. If you're not in their home, we are killing you. And even though it didn't happen, the very threat of that was enough for a lot of people to be worried and to arm themselves. And things like the African American NRA, I think it's called the BRA, or I totally forget what that's called, but basically militant African American organizations are becoming more popular because of this constant threat of white nationalist violence. And even organizations like Antifa, which have been pushed to the forefront of this discussion because of the BLM protests, Antifa itself hasn't, as far as I can tell, committed any degree of violence. Antifa hasn't conducted any bombings, it hasn't conducted any violence, and yet the president and a big chunk of the right wing have pushed a lot of attention onto Antifa, even though there's no hard evidence of their activities. A lot of people think the Black Lives protests are being organized by Antifa, and it's an international protest. How is Antifa, something that's generally centered in America and some parts of Europe, conducting protests and organizing them globally? Like, it doesn't add up. But for a lot of people, that doesn't matter if it adds up. It's what they believe, so it's what they think, so it's what they preach. And we kind of have to be in this situation where some groups are being blamed for things that aren't necessarily their fault. Other groups are committing acts of violence, and some people are actually supporting, for example, like the organized crime looting. Some people are on the side of organized crime because they are generally against these wealthy owned businesses, like jewelry stores. You know, how many small business jewelry stores are there? And as far as I know, not that many compared to the big chain jewelry stores. So who is really being punished by the activity of these organized crime? Arguably these wealthy class, which are what the general populace are fighting against or feel that they are fighting against. But it is a situation where we kind of have to look at our role that we play within these protests and riots, and also the role of these organized groups. We can't let people get away with committing criminal acts of arson, criminal acts of looting, when it's essentially just profiting or committing violence for personal benefit in a situation that's supposed to be about politics. It's supposed to be about benefiting the working class. It's supposed to be about fighting for our rights, but some people are using it as an excuse to make money. So it is a dangerous situation, and especially in the form of the Ku Klux Klan, they may not be making money by antagonizing protesters and instigating violence and threatening people with death, but they are gaining a political power and an oppressive form of power. They are using their position to strengthen themselves and to make themselves seem larger than life and make themselves more powerful by finding ways to benefit from people's fear, I would say, is what the Ku Klux Klan has been doing in this situation. Now, there have also been organizations like Antifa, which, from what I can tell, again, from what I personally can tell, from what I have seen on the internet, please correct me if I'm wrong, they haven't been doing too much other than organizing themselves amidst these protests. They are involving themselves in the protests, even though they are not the great conspiratorial controllers of the entire thing, but they are doing exactly what I would want a protesting body to do, or an organized group within a protesting body, basically creating a stronger form of defense against, say, the police when they try to scatter people. Organized groups like Antifa and the African American NRA can actually do quite a bit in stopping these protests from spiraling out of control by speaking to their membership and controlling where they go and how they act And I think that's very important. So we do need organized groups within these protests to help to some extent to control how they operate, what level of violence happens in response to what violence put upon them. But we also just need to be careful because lots of third parties are using these protests to strengthen themselves and to use the protests as a way to benefit themselves in a very selfish and I would argue dangerous way, a way that doesn't benefit the working class or benefit this wider movement. So those are generally my thoughts on this issue. If you would like to discuss with me further on this, I have my email in the About section of the Ranting Politics channel. You can leave a comment, leave a like or a dislike, subscribe if you like, and have a nice day. This has been Ranting Politics.